Today is Wednesday, January 8th of 2025, and we welcome you to our Chapter 49 podcast, the very first one for the calendar year of 2025. My name is Larry Lannan. I, of course, am a retiree and a communications volunteer for Chapter 49. We thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us either on our video version or audio. And we welcome back our chapter president, Duncan Giles.
Thanks, Larry. It's always good to be here.
Well, we had Doreen Greenwald on our podcast in December 18th. That was the last time we had a podcast. We took time off for the holidays, came back a little earlier than we thought here on a Wednesday instead of a Friday, our usual day. But I will say we talked to Doreen, thought we had everything all set up and we knew where things were going. I think it was an hour after we finished recording that podcast that everything changed all of a sudden, then went back to the way we thought it would be in the beginning. So I think we just need to get used to this, had we not.
I absolutely agree. It's, even though one party controls the House, the Senate, and will be controlling the presidency, I think that you're still going to see these same types of issues and problems with trying to get everybody together on how to do things, because they are not a unified force, let's say. And there are a lot of people who have different opinions on how they want to see things. I think we saw some of that bubble up with the speaker vote. So it's going to be interesting to see what they're able to get through, how the budget talks are going to progress, things of that nature.
So again, just to remind people what we're talking about here is that as the new Congress convenes, in the House of Representatives, one party has control by a handful of votes. So it doesn't take many defections for things to completely change. And in the Senate, it's a small majority there for one party. And in the Senate, the way those rules are with the filibuster and other rules that can gum up the works, the minority has an awful lot to say about what happens in the Senate. That has always been the case. Unless you have like a 60-vote majority, 60 votes in one party, and that has only happened a handful of times in recent history. So I think what Duncan's saying in another set of words would be, we're in for quite a ride, and we all, as federal employees who are tied into the decisions made by the president and by the United States Congress, so we need to be prepared for all this. So with that in mind, let us get into our issues. And the first issue we do want to talk about is just what we alluded to a moment ago. We do have a new administration that's to be sworn in just days after we record this. Today is the 8th. The inauguration will be on January 20th. That is a Monday this year. Happens to be on Martin Luther King's holiday also, which is kind of a strange set of circumstances, the way the calendar has landed. So I think we talked about this. I don't think we did. We did talk about this with Doreen Greenwald on December 18th, our last podcast. And her message was, everybody just remain calm. We're all watching this. Our union is prepared for whatever happens, whatever we think might happen. And at this point, we don't think it's time to get all upset and worried. We do want to make sure that you are paying attention. Your union is certainly paying attention, both at the national and the local levels, wherever you may be listening here in Chapter 49, of course, that in Indiana. And wherever you may be watching and listening and have a local chapter, they're also doing the very same thing, tied in directly to our national office. So with all that in mind, we are obviously unsure what the administration is going to do, especially in the early days. So I think at this point, we just have to wait and see what comes next.
Yeah, that's it exactly. I think your phrasing is spot on. It's going to be, as the Chinese say, may you live in interesting times, which is people say, oh, that's a nice, no, that's actually a curse, but that's neither here nor there. It's going to be interesting to see how the administration rolls things out, what buy-in they're going to get from both the House and the Senate on different issues, how much they're going to be able to pull, because anything now, as you pointed out earlier, is still going to have to be bipartisan. you're still going to need, um, Democratic votes for Republican proposals and vice versa, to get anything accomplished. Because of the fact, as you pointed out, when you said a handful in the House, I was sitting there thinking, well, maybe half a pinky, because this is one of the closest things that we've ever had, majorities we've ever had. And there's always going to be a subset of elected officials who don't want to vote for anything that the rest of the group is going for, and that could be either party. So, you're going to have to have things that are going to appeal to folks across the aisle, and that is not what the current leadership is espousing in both the House and the administration. I think the Senate, when Senator Thune, who is now the majority leader, came out and said, we are keeping the filibuster, I think that's a very strong signal that he understands how the Senate is supposed to work. And hopefully there will be more bipartisanship there. But you're going to need it in the House as well. And, there's going to have to be compromises, because you cannot rule by executive fiat in the United States.
Yeah, my major in college was political science. And if there's one thing that we learn over a period of time, is that especially in the United States Senate, it's always been the more deliberative body, and that's what the filibuster comes from. And I think the reason John Thune, the new Republican leader and the leader of the Senate now, as it convenes, the senators that have been there a while, they've been in the majority, but they've also spent time in the minority. And, since they've been in the minority in the past, they know how that feels. And in the Senate, it's not total, but there's a little more of an ability to try to come together and reach some kind of consensus with more of them. In the House, it's such a large body of 435 people that it's pretty much like a dictatorship. I mean, you have the speaker that has a lot of authority. You have a rules committee. There's a rules committee in the Senate, but the rules committee in the House, then you may see people arguing all the time about who's going to be on the rules committee, who's going to chair the rules committee. Why is that such a big deal? Because in the House of Representatives, anything comes before that, the rules committee decides the rules that that measure will have to come under. It tells you how many, how the length of the debate, how many amendments you can have, and if you have very few amendments, that can make a very big difference in the final version of any measure that passes the House, goes to the Senate. When you have to come up with a bill for, in the end, with some conference committee or some other way of coming together, how that comes out of the House is important. So, we're getting into some of the weeds of governing, but it's important. The reason we talk about this, Duncan, is because we fully expect to have some measures before the Congress that will impact federal employees. And we are worried that they could adversely impact federal employees. And it's our job as a union to band together. We think it's a bad idea, that we need to let our people who will represent us know that. And this process that is going to be used is very key in how these final decisions are made.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, you see some things that are proposed, like the latest NTU National e-Bulletin, where it's talking about the Holman rule that they want to do, HOLMAN, in the fact that they can reduce any federal employee. If this would pass, they would be able to reduce any federal employee who is opposed, as they see it, to their policies, their salary to $1. And you can't imagine that something like that would even be considered, much less voted on successfully, but it's possible. So, these are things that we look at as NTU leaders. NTU National, Doreen Greenwald is president, Terry Scott is vice president. Our entire staff there is looking at it very closely. We're working on the Hill to try and, make sure that people of both parties understand the implications on federal employees. and as well as local chapters doing what they can. But we also need individual members to contact their members of Congress from time to time to let them know that they don't want to see something passed because it's very harmful. And doing letters or phone calls, especially letters, are very easily done through the ntu.org website. It takes maybe 2 minutes to do. So, we're going to be asking folks for their help just to protect what we have from some of the more interesting, let's call them interesting, possible proposals that come out of Congress.
Yeah, that Holman measure is just an awful idea in every way you can think of it. How could any organization exist under such a rule? I don't care if you're a government, a nonprofit group, or a for-profit corporation. You couldn't have a staff with a rule like that. You couldn't exist and function. So that's our biggest message on that. So I guess the bottom line message before we move on, Duncan, is yes, we're paying attention. We hear what's being said, and a lot is being said right now. We're much more focused on what is and is not done, and we will pay attention to that.
Exactly. You're exactly right. Yeah, it's right now, there's still a lot of hyperbole. I don't believe we're going to invade Greenland. I don't think Canada is going to become the 51st state. So there are a lot of things that are being said right now, but we have to wait to see what's going to be coming out in executive orders from the White House, proposals from both the House and the Senate, and how they progress, things of that nature. That's what we really want to concentrate on.
Just an aside, when I worked for IRS, I spent some time in Detroit when I was traveling, doing training and so forth. And I remember spending a little time in Canada and getting to know some Canadians. It takes a lot to get them worked up. They're pretty laid back, stiff,
Yep.
Formal people. I think they're worked up now. So
yeah, I think so.
That's all I'll say about that. Let's move to telework, another issue that we talked to Doreen Greenwald about on December 18th when we had her on our podcast right before the Christmas break. And her big point to us, and you've made this point as well, and it's good to hear her reinforce this, is that, contracts that NTU has, all 36 agencies where we represent the employees. We all have language wherever we have contracts. We have some language on telework. At the IRS, we've had this since the 1990s. We've had some version of what we then called flexi places morphed into telework with the technology we have today. So with telework, we still have contractual language, which will continue. And so that will not change. It would take it would take a law change to subrogate our contract that we have with IRS. Now, that does have to be renegotiated in a period of time, but it's still going to be good for another, I think, 2 to 2.5 years. You can tell me more about that. But we want to make the point that there's a lot of talk about telework. Telework is still there. You're still entitled to it to the extent that our contract gives you that entitlement and has given it to you in some way, shape, or form since the 1990s. So be aware that no change in the IRS entitlement under the contract to telework, and no change under any other contract that's in force where NTE was entered into an agreement with an agency.
Yeah, legally, the only way that can change is if they do a reopener, and we've already had our midterm reopener, and telework was not changed for that. So basically, unless Congress changes the law, as you said, to force employees to go back to the office instead of working from home, and as we've mentioned ad nauseum, working from home is more beneficial for everybody and productive, then they legally can't do it. Now, could we see something like the administration saying, okay, by executive order, we're saying that we're removing everybody from telework and we want them to work 5 days a week from the office? Legally, no. And if that happened, I'm not privy to the inner workings of the legal strategy on this from NTU National, but I'd bet my bottom dollar we'd be in court that day, challenging that law, challenging that executive order, whatever form it takes. because it would be illegal. So, rest assured, NTU is all over this, but there should not be a substantive change in telework, even though you're hearing this. And the other part of this is, okay, let's say they do for whatever reason, however they do it, through, they make the muggles go back to work and through some sort of magic, Harry Potter, where are they going to put everybody? All we've been doing is, rent reduction, space reduction, so now we've got a lot of places where we're into hoteling and desk sharing and things of that nature. And there's not enough desks for the people to all come back at once. Now, that's something you never see discussed by any of the representatives or the incoming administration or anybody else. So there's literally no place to put everyone. So that's a huge hurdle as well.
Duncan, the thing that has, I think, upset federal employees, in all agencies, is this talk by this DOGE committee or commission or whatever they call this advisory commission that the incoming president has put together. They've been rather open about this. They say they want all federal employees to come back into the office 5 days a week and full time, but they say they want to do this because they want federal employees to quit and just not replace them. I mean, that's an odd sort of strategy to have. Since you don't know who's going to quit, how can you still run the agency if you're just going to let people quit and just let attrition take care of it, and you have nobody to do certain tasks within these agencies that need to be done? But this seems to be the strategy. So I think this is where a lot of the angst comes in amongst the workforce. But I think we need to keep in mind, contracts are still there. I think the Social Security Administration now has a contract that goes past the 4 years of the Trump administration. So they actually have, unless again there's a law change, they've got a guarantee of their telework contract through that. Well, ours is through a good part of it, not the entire part at IRS, for example. So I think how should employees feel about this talk that they keep hearing from people in the incoming administration that they're using telework, the taking away of telework, if it can be done, as a way of trying to reduce the federal workforce? Of course, a rather odd sort of strategy.
Yeah, it is. It is interesting, as you said. As we said earlier, though, this is talk. Right now, we're concentrating on what bills are brought up in Congress, what executive orders are coming out of the White House, things of that nature. So, people can say a lot of things. When people talk about the DOGE Commission, that is going to be an advisory committee to Congress. They can't force anything. They can't make any laws, anything of that nature. They're strictly advisory, specifically to OPM, but they're going to have, I'm sure, from what I've heard, congressional liaisons, surprise, surprise, for this. But, we need to look at what's actually going to be done legally, not what's being done verbally. So right now, status quo, don't panic, don't freak out. Don't think on January 21st, you're all going to have to come back to the office if you're teleworking. Do not do that. Just be mindful, take a look at the situations and places where you're getting your news from. And, you and I are always going to give it to people straight. Good, bad, or indifferent, we're going to give it to people straight. National NTU is going to be doing the same thing. Other chapters are going to be doing the same thing. So we'll let you know what's going on, good or bad. So when you hear stuff, check with your local chapters. If you're in Indiana, feel free to contact me, and we'll talk about it. But like I said, right now there shouldn't be anything happening in a change. It should be status quo for telework.
Another item we discussed with Doreen Greenwald when she was on our podcast December 18th was the budget. Now, at that time, it looked like there would be a continuing resolution. Then there was a glitch, and it looked like there might be a government shutdown all of a sudden after we talked to her. It ended up not happening in the end. but there were some changes made in the final version of that continuing resolution. So IRS and other federal agencies are under our previous year's budget, at least through mid-March now, unless there's an agreement earlier than that, but we don't count on that one. So but we're still on last year's budget, which is not, really sufficient. A lot of agencies are very concerned about this, of being able to conduct their mission, even keeping their staff whole with last year's budget through mid-March. What does it look like for IRS as best as you can see?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I know that our current commissioner, Commissioner Werfel, is definitely on the Hill, letting people know that we do need the extra money. Looks like when they did the continuing resolution, that they did claw back another $20 billion that we got from the Inflation Reduction Act, and that's not good. We need that money to upgrade our technologies and things of that nature. It's not going to have an impact right away, but it could down the road. So we need to have those funds to beef up our employment, to beef up our technology, things of that nature. And we have to have adequate funding. Otherwise, we're going to be falling behind. There are some in Congress who are upset that IRS is getting back in the business of looking at, being able to file tax returns again, because it's taking away money, I guess, from my guess is from, contributors who make a profit from that. I'm all for the IRS doing tax returns, just because of the fact that, that's what the people need. Let's get them a bigger cost. It's better for the American taxpayer. That should be something that's emphasized instead of downgraded. And that's going to be playing a part, I'm sure, in our budget when they talk about those types of things. So it's going to be some interesting discussions, I'm sure, between now and March. You also have the debt ceiling that's going to be coming up rapidly as well, that I'm sure will be wrapped up in all of this. So we're going to be wondering if we are going to have a newer budget. Are they going to do another continuing resolution, or what's going to happen? And again, with the new administration coming in, with the newly formed Congress that we really haven't had a sense yet of, how is this all going to work? We just don't know.
So there's a lot of wait and see there as well. I mean, some people
Yep.
have been concerned with the previous year's budget. Will there be furloughs, RIFs? But there's no indication of that yet. There's certainly no RIFs involved, but there's always that danger of furloughs where people might have to take a day off every 2 weeks. You and I have both been through that in the past. People have been talking about, is that a possibility? Well, you never know, but at least at this point, we know of no plans to do that, correct?
Correct. Yeah, there have been no conversations nationally between IRS or Treasury and National NTU on doing, like you said, the spot furloughs, or even RIFs, or for those of you who are out there hoping for the early retirement or the separation incentive payments. We've not heard anything on that either. So again, it's all wait and see at this point, and that's what we're going to need to do. Once we do have an idea of what's happening, then we'll be able to move forward and figure out what's going to be best for our employees and the taxpayers.
As I mentioned earlier, we're recording this on the morning of January 8th. On January 9th, it will be the funeral service for former President Jimmy Carter. Federal government will be closed that day. There'll be no mail service. That's what we're closing down the government as we would for a holiday, although we are just observing the fact that that is the funeral for a former president. We've done this for every former president at the time of their funeral. I think when you look back on the legacy of Jimmy Carter as a president, there's a lot to say, and I won't get into everything. You and I have talked about some of this in the past. When it comes to federal employees, I can't overestimate the importance and the continuing and lasting legacy of the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978 that took effect in 1979, if I recall correctly. I was not in federal service at that time, but my father was. And he talked to me at length about just what a game changer this was going to be, about how federal employee unions, which had kind of been associations that didn't have a lot of legal authority, all of a sudden could actually do representation for the people for which they represent. And that has continued to the present day. It has been enhanced in ways. So, but it started with President Jimmy Carter, and he was instrumental in the passage of that Civil Service Reform Act of 1978 that changed the whole landscape of employee management relations in the federal sector. And I'd like to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, it was absolutely huge. And the late President Carter deserves an awful lot of credit for using a lot of political capital to try and push this through. It wasn't the most popular idea from what I've read in Congress, but he really made a push for it because he believed in, that this was the right thing to do for employees. And, people have differing opinions on President Carter on his term in office. I think what's happened is the longer that it's been away from his particular term, the more it's looked at as, it wasn't as bad as everybody possibly thought back then. And there were a lot of good things that he did. And on a personal note, I just think he is probably one of the most decent men. He may not have been the best president, but he was probably the most decent man who's ever been president. He was just a wonderful human being by any stretch of the imagination, a great partner to his wife, Rosalind. And, it's a sad day when his passing, but, the world needs more Jimmy Carters in the way that folks act. The work that he did for Habitat Humanity, the work that he's done for world peace to try and get fair elections, things of that nature. So I think that, it's very important that we remember those types of things as well.
Well said, Duncan. I really cannot add to that. So let's move on and let's have your final comment for this podcast.
My final comment is, life is short. You never know what's going to happen. People can pass suddenly. Some things can happen medically. You just never know what's going to happen. So make sure that you do things that you enjoy in life. Over Christmas break, my wife and I, my wonderful wife Kim and I, took a trip down to the Keys in Florida, just to spend the holiday down there, Christmas holiday down there, and just did things that we enjoyed. One thing I've done one time before, I wanted to do again, and we did parasail, and by golly, Kim did it. Got up there on a parasail and did it herself, and she was very nervous. It was almost a game time decision in the boat whether she was going to do it or not, but she decided to do it. She had always wanted to swim with dolphins, so we did a thing where she could swim. We swam with dolphins. So do experiences, especially with those who are close friends, loved ones, things of that nature. Do the things that you can to enjoy life while you're here, while you're able, because that's truly what you need to do to enjoy life, in my opinion.
So I'm glad to hear that Kim decided to take the plunge and go parasailing. So I assume she's already planned her next parasailing event, right?
The word I got was that she'll be happy to be an observer the next time I parasail was what she got.
Oh, okay. And that's each your own. And
Exactly.
my final comment is just to emphasize something we've talked about before and was finalized during the our interregnum from the podcast. That's the repeal of the windfall elimination provision of Social Security and the government pension offset. It has a very big impact on me, so I'll be open about that. I worked in the private sector for about 15 some years, ended up going to work for the federal government, one of the last people hired under the civil service system. So I've been under that civil service retirement system and a windfall elimination provision that has limited my Social Security benefits. And if anything happened to my wife, I would not have had any access to a survivor benefit. That's all changed now. we don't know when I'm going to get more money in my Social Security because the SSA is going to have to figure out a way to get this done. It's retroactive to the beginning of 2024, so there'll be retroactive payments plus changes in the monthly benefits. I am just thankful that happened. I do think it's an unfair kind of thing. What happened is people thought there was a windfall going on, so what Congress did is what they often do. They went way too far the other way and eliminating it. And so now I think things have evened out a little better. There are really a lot fewer people under civil service retirement like myself who also have enough Social Security quarters to qualify for both. I'm very thankful to the Congress and the President, President Biden, for supporting this piece of legislation. It's been 10 to 15 years in the making. It's
Yeah.
been introduced in Congress, I think, every year, every session at least. And there's been bipartisan support. There's been at least one Democrat, one Republican who signed on to it. It's just that Congress never made it a priority until this past Congress. So I'm thankful to our elected officials for righting a wrong, not just for me, but for millions of people like myself in the federal sector, but also people on the local level, police officers, teachers, other local civil servants that also were impacted by this windfall elimination provision. Just want to say thank you, Congress. Thank you, President. You finally righted a wrong. And I appreciate it, and so do many other people like myself. With that, thank you, Duncan Giles, for joining the podcast once again. This is the Chapter 49 podcast. If all goes well, we'll be back next week with another podcast edition for you. So in the meantime, please be safe and be kind.